Left-wing freedom, traditionalist freedom. Which is real? It is a strange occurrence that in today's politics, two opposing political ideologies claim to carry the banner of freedom. But what is the truth? In this video essay, I hope to explain how both ideologies came to carry the banner of freedom, and hopefully reveal to you the true meaning and origins of freedom. We will first examine the origins of traditional freedom. Many millennia ago, the European people lived in family groups, traveling in search of sustenance, but still remaining in a limited geographic region. At this time, Europeans began a higher level of thinking and questioned their place in the universe. Naturally, different groups of people found different answers and passed down their thoughts to their children. These were the first spiritual teachings of the Europeans and revolved around the origins of the family, as well as what is the right way to conduct oneself. However, in order to procreate and avoid incest, these primitive people had to interact with other families to attain women. This posed an issue as families held different beliefs which influenced their ideals of behavior. This led families who shared similar spiritual beliefs to associate with each other more readily. Eventually, these families who held similar beliefs would become blood relatives through repeated exchange of family members. The result of this process eliminated the desire for conflict between groups as distant relatives were more trustworthy than complete strangers, and led to the first relatively large-scale collaboration between humans. With these large numbers of people, it was easier to manage labor, and so they founded communities around shared spiritual values and blood ties. However, this was not to say that the ancient Europeans all followed the same religion. At the same time, religion was unique to the family, specifically close relatives, telling stories of mythic ancestors and their great actions. When the Europeans founded their first settlements, it was to the mutual benefit and with mutual respect between their religions. So we find that the origination of traditionalist freedom can be found in the spiritual emergence of the European people, with families who shared similar values and blood ties coming together in collaborative survival, not with one family becoming subservient to another, but with both families establishing a mutual respect for each other. Alternatively, the origins of the idea of freedom on the left comes from the civil rights movement of the 1960s. For those who are unfamiliar, the civil rights movement existed from 1954 and lasted until 1968, mainly focusing on segregation and racial disenfranchisement. At the time, white Americans had elected to live apart from the African American population and chose not to interact with them. This led to many left-wing political ideologies pointing to this desire for separation as the reason for the poor economic status of the African American community. As a result, it was then felt necessary for political action to take place, escalating to riots in some cases. Regardless of the wishes of the people, the Civil Rights Act was passed, compelling people to live together and criminalizing the ability to choose who you live and work with. This is the essence of left-wing freedom, or at least its point of origination. But what if we were applying these concepts of freedom as a founding principle? What is the logical conclusion of traditionalist freedom and left-wing freedom with regards to how a state would operate and structure itself? Well, in regards to traditionalist freedom, whilst ancient families respected each other's beliefs, they still had issues occur between families, with no way to resolve them, as different families held their own religious beliefs. In this case, a third party was brought in to arbitrate justice. This third party being the patriarch of a third family, who was often well respected or commanded a lot of influence. This is coincidentally how the first European kingdoms were established, with kings acting as judges and enforcers of the law. As communities grew bigger, the need for protection of the peace grew. The ancient kings took tribute as a form of payment for resolving community issues, and in turn used this tribute to pay for weapons, warriors, and fortresses. It was of the highest importance at the time for the king to not only be an effective judge to maintain the peace, but also have the ability to enforce rulings, because if he couldn't, then he was ineffective in administrating justice. This led to the kings of old creating borders for their kingdoms, which effectively outlined the jurisdiction of the monarch. As it would be an impossible task for the king to protect people over large distances, an area of jurisdiction would need to be outlined to show his subjects where his law was applicable. Philosophically, this structured society in a manner that placed limits upon the king's power, by the king having to draw physical borders and marking what was and what wasn't within his ability to legislate. In essence, by the king having to draw borders to indicate where he could enforce laws, he also indicated that there was a region outside of which his laws did not apply. Much like how kingdoms are divided by their borders, indicating which governing body's authority is recognized where, likewise internally our society is found to have borders indicating different forums in which people interact. Summarizing these forums, you have the family, the community, and then the state. There are much more, but for the sake of brevity, let's keep it to these three. Now, as a king has to respect the borders of his kingdom, so does he also philosophically have to recognize the borders of his society. Make no mistake, a king does have a higher power, but that higher power is manifest in the regulation and mediation of borders, not the entities which these borders outline. This is further compounded from the top-down view of the traditional kingdom, in that at the top there is the king's family, then the king interacts with his governing body, a community of advisors and other figures of influence. From the king's governing body extends the rest of the nation, a collection of communities all contained within the national borders, which indicate the king's jurisdiction. It is through these borders and their management that a traditional government is operated, and any infringement of the borders, external or internal, is deemed a threat to the traditional system. In comparison, the conceptualization of freedom from a leftist perspective is quite different. As we previously established upon analyzing the origination of leftwing freedom in the civil rights movement, we see freedom not as the recognition of borders, but in their destruction. As left-wing politics is often centered around the destruction of racial and class distinction, I think it's fair to assume that the freedom that the left-wing desires to bring about is centered around achieving equality. But what is equality? Equality can be boiled down to placing everyone at a similar position in society. How this is achieved appears to be both totalitarian in nature and hypocritical. First, we will identify what it takes to put everyone on equal footing. If we want to achieve this, it means that all form of individuality must be stripped from people. After all, if you play the piano, but I paint on canvas, there is an inherent difference in our expression, not to mention talent. If I become financially successful with my paintings, but you get tips from busking, then we are made financially unequal. This applies universally for any form of ability. Although it sounds ridiculous, the goal of social equality is to enforce uniform ability in people. And to do that, you will need to effectively strip people of ambition and desire, else they might be able to outperform their peers. Secondly, the hypocrisy of trying to achieve freedom of equality in the form of a governing body is that any form of government is placed above the people. If a nation wants to apply equality across its populace, it needs to legislate laws and for people to recognize that the government has authority and therefore power over them. This stands in conflict to the idea of equality. This stands in conflict with the idea of equality in that any government official holds the power that no one else has, and has to make decisions which are inherently biased, based on the person in question's perspectives, thus leading individuals to have unequal influence over the body of the populace. Not to mention that the idea of equality demands every facet of life be regulated to ensure that no one is positioned higher in any way over another person, despite the paradox of government. In conclusion, we find the traditional freedom to be that which empowers individuality and mutual respect through the ability to freely associate and disassociate with whom we choose. In the reverse, we find left-wing freedom to be the opposite, that it not only seeks to destroy that which may differentiate people, but also enforce an all-encompassing tyranny that seeks to control people so that they may achieve an equal lifestyle. It is a wonder to me that anyone could confuse the two, but that seems to be the point. If we were to analyze left-wing freedom, we would expose it for the horror that it is. And so it would appear that the supposed good virtue is borrowed from the superior nature of traditional freedom. Until next time.